I do. I'm an avid knitter. This is my latest project, my beeswax scarf. I took up knitting when I was, many years ago, when I was on the road with Broadway shows, because I learned very quickly that when I was reading books, it was really hard to be reading ensconced in your book, and then you'd hear the cue line and you'd have to throw the book down to play and not miss your entrance. And then I quickly realized that if I took up knitting, because I could use circular needles, it was much easier to throw it down and be able to pick back up where you were. And you can also keep it in your lap a lot easier than having an open book. I love barbecue, and I've already had barbecue while I've been here, and I've only been here 2 days. I'm obsessed with barbecue, but I'm sort of a bit of a barbecue purist in the sense that I don't necessarily believe that meats need sauce on there, because if the flavor of the meat isn't good enough, then it's not a real barbecue restaurant. And I'm also not a fan of the vinegar-based barbecue. I'm not a big fan of North Carolina barbecue because that has...
Yeah, Kansas City's a nice happy medium between sauce and smoke.
Yes, but the burnt ends I had the other night were really good. The difference between a tour and on Broadway. Well, I was young when I toured, so that was a different time. I did really enjoy touring because that really sticks to the adage that no two performances are ever alike. When you're touring with musicals, for instance, I toured with The Lion King, and when we toured that, we traveled, it was a large orchestra that we traveled, but we also picked up local musicians. And part of the fun of touring can be bringing in local musicians, because it means that the sound of the show is going to be different every week or every 2 weeks when you're in different cities. So you get to meet a lot of musicians around the country, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. But it really does keep the show electric, and it keeps it a living, breathing organism, which I enjoy. When you're on Broadway, musicians are actually allowed to sub out of the pit. So the rule is that you're allowed to essentially, I'm distilling it a bit, but essentially you're allowed to sub out half your shows a week. So you do 8 shows a week. So technically you're allowed to miss up to 4 a week before you get in trouble with the union. So that also does present an interesting sound difference every night, because once the show opens, then the subbing policy begins, and at that point you rarely, if ever, end up with the same orchestra that you've hired from the beginning. And so that makes it really interesting as a conductor. I always enjoyed, as I got older, I've enjoyed having subs more. In the beginning, it's actually quite a challenge, because you have to learn how to actually conduct to those subs, because it makes you very aware of, oh, the flute has a solo here, so I need to be sure to be vigilant and cue that person a little bit ahead of where that cue is going to be, to really make sure that they lean in on that, because part of your job as a conductor is to make sure that you're maintaining the musical integrity for what the people on stage are used to hearing 8 times a week. You never want to hear from an actor on stage, ooh, that sounded different than it did before. Because what you're trying to preserve is that same sound that you basically create for the opening of the show. If I could have one superpower. Gosh, that's like Pandora's box opening. If I could have one superpower, it would be I would wish I could play anything on the piano at any time and not have to be able to practice it. For me, it's funny because I'm coming back to this show so many years later, 13 years later, and I opened the score and I started playing through it again. I was like, did I really do this before? It's literally funny how certain things stayed in muscle memory, but other things just out. And so for me, it was like, wow, really having to sit there and woodshed that again. That's a great question. I was 28 when I did Sondheim on Broadway, so I was wee but a child. And to be in the room with Stephen Sondheim and James Lapine and Michael Starobin, who did the orchestrations, there was a lot of Broadway history in that room, and for me that was sort of a once-in-a-lifetime experience. And I'll never forget, I went up to Sondheim at the opening night party, and I think I said, "Mr. Sondheim, would it be possible to get a picture together?" And he said, "For you, of course, you've worked the hardest on this process." And I remember just feeling very moved by that. And Steve was an interesting character because he was such an intellectual, but he was so deeply devoted to having actors bring out the best performances at all times. And he cared deeply that his work really delivered on a very communicative level with the audiences. And I think one of the most beautiful things about this show is that because it's narrated by Sondheim himself, you're learning so much about who he is as a person, as an artist, and that's complemented by then the singers bringing the songs to life. So for me, it was really, in many ways, not only was the rehearsal process a masterclass in working with somebody like this, but nightly, it was a masterclass of realizing how much the work of Sondheim is similar to the works of Mozart, Beethoven, Wagner, all of these great artists whose works have become timeless because as we get older, we continue to find new treasures inside of the music and allow it to evolve as we continue to mature. I don't have one. I'm looking for my Casey spots. It's wherever I can find the barbecue. Is where it's like we were driving here today and I was like, oh, barbecue restaurant, oh, barbecue restaurant. And I'm very excited. I want to go to the art museum and go play mini golf. So that is something I'm very much looking forward to here. And I also love that Casey has, I believe, second to Paris, the most number of fountains per capita of any city in the world.